Hi, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Levi Old, and I'm the project coordinator for the Northwest Basin and Range Synthesis project. Today's webinar is called Identifying Shared Conservation Priorities. On today's webinar, the presenters will be Nick Solaski of Foundations of Success and Tom Ewald, of United States Fish and Wildlife Service. And today, Sarah Sanborn of Enviro Issues is helping do some of the logistical support for our webinar. Just want to go over a little bit of the logistics for today's webinar. On your screen, you'll notice a small collapse control panel in the upper right corner. If you click on a small orange icon, the control panel will open up. In the expanded control panel, you can send a question. Simply type your question into the chat area and push send. Respond to questions and comments at the end of the webinar today. In today's webinar, we'll be discussing how the Northwest Basin and Range Synthesis project is going about the processing of science and expert opinion into conservation priorities. If you want to learn more about the project, please visit our webpage or send me an email and I will be happy to explain more. I'd like to share the three main components of today's webinar. First, Nick Solaski will present an overview of the open standards for the practice of conservation tool that we're using to synthesize information. Second, Tom Ewald will give a brief example of how we're using the tool. And then I will give a quick brief on the process of setting up meetings, which we'll be doing and have already started doing for the rest of the summer and into the early fall. Now I'm going to pass it off to Nick. So it's all you, Nick.
Okay. Thanks, Levi. And as soon as I get my screen presented here, I will show my screen. Let's see, go to the WebEx. Okay, so my job here is to give you a quick overview of the open standards for the practice of conservation, which is a framework and toolkit for real-world adaptive management of conservation projects and programs. So I'll talk briefly about the open standards and then give you some examples of how fish and wildlife agencies and other folks have used the open standards for adaptive management. I work for Foundations of Success. We are a not-for-profit organization. We've been around about 16 years. And we work with folks of all shapes and sizes to help them design, manage, monitor, and learn from conservation projects and programs. So we don't actually implement conservation projects ourselves, but we try to make our partners' projects better. I also represent something broader called the Conservation Measures Partnership, or CMP. CMP is not a legal entity. It is a community of practice. It started as a one-day meeting from some of the representatives of some of the NGOs that you see here, where people got together to talk about performance measures, learning, and adaptive management within our respective organizations. We found we had so much to talk about that we turned it into a regular thing. We brought in other NGOs from around the world that you see here. In recent years, we've been adding in some of the private foundations who work in conservation and resource management as well. And then we've also been adding various government agencies. And so you can see some of the agencies here, including the Fish and Wildlife Service and USAID, are actually formal members of the partnership. Many of these other agencies around the world may not be formal members of the partnership, but they're working on these issues and using the tools and systems that I'm going to share with you. So we're interested in managing conservation and natural resource management projects, which come in all shapes and sizes. For us, a project is a group of people doing to change the world in some desirable way. And it could be as simple as my neighbors getting together to clean up some litter and manage invasive plants on the Potomac Gorge with no outside help or consultants. It could be a state or fish and wildlife refuge. It could be a range-wide management plan for chimpanzees in Tanzania. It could be a state wildlife action plan for California or Idaho, or standard performance measures that I'll talk about in a bit. So as you all probably know, conservation and natural resource management projects take place in very complex and dynamic systems. They need to deal with ongoing and unpredictable change, and we're dealing with rapidly changing competitors who are interested in the same resources. We also lack complete information. We have to take immediate action in the face of uncertainty. We need to report on our performance to our funders and supporters, and we can improve and we can learn. So people have come up with this idea of adaptive management as sort of ways of solving those challenges and constraints. Some people treat adaptive management as doing whatever you want. You try something, if it doesn't work, well, then you say, hey, boss, sorry it didn't work, I was doing adaptive management. We don't want to be quite that loose about it. But it really stems from some work that Buzz Holling and his colleagues did in the 1970s and 80s. They were academic ecologists, but they decided to treat their policies, the work they were doing as experiments, to develop models to understand the system and the experiment, and then conduct either passive or active experimentation to see where those interventions might work or not work. It was pretty cool and exciting stuff, but being academics, I think they were constrained a little bit by reaching, in the way they reached out to policymakers. They knew they needed to reach out to land use managers and other policymakers, and they knew they had to simplify what they were doing it so that the policymakers would understand, but their efforts looked something like this, where they would have a bunch of mathematical equations. So you can see equation 9 is both simple and important, or they would present their findings in sort of graphs that look something like this, which was supposed to be used for policy analysis, but I don't know about you, if you took that to your boss and said, boss, here's where I think we need to be, you might have some problems. So it was really interesting, cool stuff, but it wasn't maybe quite as practical as it could be. So a few years back, we in the Conservation Measures Partnership, interested in these issues, said, well, what can we learn from how other fields have approached this question? So we looked at business and management and development and public health. And in all those different systems, we found different places where people are doing work, we found people had hit upon similar actions. We also found that we were confusing the heck out of each other with words, that what one group called a target, another group called an outcome, another group called a goal, we were all meaning the same things, but we were using words in very complex ways. So we took the results of both that research and this analysis of what our different groups were doing and used it to come up with a set of common standards for doing conservation and natural resource management work. So these are the open standards for the practice of conservation. The word open in it means it's open source. Nobody owns it. Anyone can take it and do what they want with it. And it's being used around the world to design, manage, monitor, and learn from conservation projects. So these are the open standards. I'll show you in just a second what the various steps are. I do want to emphasize, though, that there's nothing radically new here. This is project management that people have been doing for a long time, ever since Deming, plan, check, do, act. But what we've done is kind of created a set of tools to go through that process in a way that might be helpful for conservation work. So what the open standards ask you to do at its most high level is they ask a team of people to talk about what is the project scope, what is it you care about. Are you managing a small bay here? Are you managing an entire ocean? To talk about who's on the project team, a key part of adaptive management is that you want the resource managers involved in the conservation and then in the planning. They're not hiring outside people to do all the work for them. They're intimately involved in the process of management. We then ask people, just like Buzz Holling talked about mathematical models, we want to have a model of the system so that there's a shared understanding of what's going on. We do this through more diagrammatic or conceptual models. So we ask people to specify what they care about, their targets, as well as maybe the threats, the things that are affecting those targets. So in this case, that turtle is becoming someone's dinner. There may be a fish population that's being affected by commercial harvesting, but that fish also provides an important protein source for the local community. So we're trying to understand the system that's going on. Step 2 then says, well, how are we going to treat our actions as interventions to change that system? And what makes a plan strategic in our point of view is that it specifies not just what you will do, but also what you're not going to do and why. It's about making systematic choices. And so the open standards have a bunch of tools to help people, as Tom will show you later, to prioritize which targets require attention, which threats are most critical, and how we can spend our limited time and treasure to change the situation. Once you've come up with an action that you want to undertake, in this case we're going to work with the community to set up a community managed no-take reserve. You can then look at the theory of change or the hypothesis about how that action is going to lead to the desired outcomes. So in this case there's a hypothesis that if we set up that no-take zone, we'll allow the clams and other invertebrates to breed, and we'll have more clams both for humans and for biodiversity purposes. So then you actually have to measure what you're doing. In this case we're counting the number of clams inside and outside the no-take zone before and after we set up the intervention. And then you have to analyze that data. So in this case, the blue bars show you the number of clams they had before. The orange show you the number of clams after. In this case, their hypothesis worked. But you may find other cases where your hypothesis didn't work as planned, and then you have to adapt what's going on and learn from it. And so thus the 5th step in the cycle is to take your lessons, share them both amongst your project team, but also with the rest of the world that wants to learn from what you've done. So when we talk about adaptive management, we actually mean going through the steps in the open standards in an iterative fashion. You can use the open standards, although if you're you also can use similar equivalent systems. So EPA has their version of this, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has their version of this. There are really different ways of going through that project management process. So now I just want to turn and show you a few examples of different folks who have used these tools. I'll just do it at a very high level. People, for example, have used it to manage a particular refuge. This is Fish and Wildlife Service work in Region 8. Similar work is going on in other parts of the country as well. But they're basically taking this refuge, these lands, they're coming up with an open standards plan to manage these different units and these different types of systems within this overall area. Another example, now going to Africa, this is a joint conservation work to save or to do conservation of chimpanzees across Tanzania. So this is species-based work. This is a whole consortium of organizations led by the Jane Goodall Institute in this particular case. And so what they've done is they're looking at chimp conservation at different scales. Gombe National Park, where Jane Goodall did her research, is this little postage stamp. It by itself is not sufficient to do conservation, so they're looking at broader areas and even the entire chimp population in western Tanzania as the management management system that they're trying to look after. So in this case, we use the open standards to come up with our conservation targets, the chimps, and in this case elephants, terrestrial habitats, and aquatic systems. And we look at those particular targets. We look at also some of the human well-being values that come out of this system as well. And we can also do threats and go through the open standards. An example, again, closer to home, is we've also used this to do landscape conservation with the Idaho State Wildlife Action Plan, as well as for California State Wildlife Action Plan. In this case, in Idaho, we took Idaho and divided into 14 different ecological sections, in this case the Blue Mountains, which you see here. And for each of those, we again come up with those targets that help us think about what are the important landscape or habitat or ecosystem elements of the system, species that we want to track as well. What are those human well-being needs that we need to worry about? And again, what are some of the threats? What are the things that are affecting those targets? So we're using this open standards to sort of get a systems approach to doing conservation in Idaho. The last example I want to show you is more looking at some of the performance indicators and using the open standards to come up with standard measures of how work is doing. In this case, some of you might be familiar with the State Wildlife Grants Program. It's a program that allocates a fair amount of money to all 56 states and territories to do conservation work. But in the budget climate that we have in Washington, D.C., we need to justify this grant money that's being spent. And so we asked our OMB examiner a few years back, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is that we have a means of evaluating the effectiveness of these different projects funded with the state wildlife grants? And the dude looked at us and, of course, said 15. It's the currency of what we need to be able to do. The problem we had is that we were doing a lot of individual actions, but we didn't really know how to roll them up or make sense of them. So we might be in Kentucky and we might be funding some work to gate caves and mines with the idea that if we gate the caves and mines, we can reduce human access and disturbance by feral cats, and that will help these bat populations that we care about. And we have indicators that we could actually measure to show both the outcomes as well as intermediate steps along the way. If we go to a completely different system, also funded by a state wildlife grant, in this case the beaches of Massachusetts, here we're working on piping plovers. Here the threat is human access, but it's more dune buggies and things rolling up and down the beach, as well as dogs and cats that might be disturbing the nesting chicks. In this case, it's a completely different target, different threat, different system, different area, and yet you can see the underlying logic is much the same. So that led us to this idea that we could actually use the open standards to create generic results chains for common actions that are being implemented by our community and come up with standard indicators to measure how those are happening. That led us to come up with, for 11 of the most common state actions under the State Wildlife Grants Program, to come up with, for each of those, for example, species restoration, what is the definition of the action, what are some examples, what does that generic results chain look like, and for that generic results chain, we could then come up with specific measures and even monitoring questions that we could ask people as they applied for and reported on funding. So we were able to do that again. That would lead to questionnaires that could be asked of grantees. All they would have to do is answer these questions related to that theory of change, and then based on that, we could actually put all that information into the Wildlife and Sport Forest Restoration's TRACS database, where they could actually roll up this information and make sense of it. So we now have standard results chains for 11 common state conservation actions. We did similar work with the Fish and Wildlife Service in Central Africa, looking at work that's happening overseas with elephants and with tigers and other kinds of work as well. Well, not tigers in Africa, but tigers in Asia. And we have these sort of standardized actions that we're looking for to do the world. We were able to take that information, and it really did make OMB happy. now that there's evidence that they're really trying to standardize and get that information, they're able to fight for that program. And in fact, if you've been tracking the news, AFWA is able to actually have a bill in the House of Representatives to raise over another $1 billion in oil and gas excise money to support conservation work, because we're able to show more strategically and more effectively how things are working out. So in short, conservation and natural resource management projects come in all shapes and sizes, as I showed you before, but we can use the open standards at all these different shapes and scales in order to do better adaptive management and result in better conservation work. So I'll pause there and turn it back over to Tom.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Nick. Looks like I'll show my screen now. And so, yeah, I'll take over from where Nick left off and kind of get back to our geography here in the Northwest Basin and Range. And here's a map that represents, the area that we're talking about. And this is where we want to develop that, kind of systems level understanding of this larger ecosystem that Nick was talking about, using the open standards and some of the tools within the open standards to help us collectively come up with a common understanding of the condition of things that we care about. What are some of the threats, and then what are some strategies? So, this is, again, the geography located around the Northwest Basin and Range and some of the land ownership patterns that you see as well. So, when we started this project several months ago and we reached out to people, one of the first things that we heard was that, there's been a lot of planning, there's been a lot of research, there's been a lot of assessments across this area. So don't recreate the wheel, but at the same time, there's this kind of thought that, there is a lot of information in science today. It hasn't been synthesized and put together, and that kind of gets at the, kind of the name of this project, the Northwest Basin and Range Synthesis. And people ask that we do a bit of homework first before going out. So, what we're going to do when we go out and outreach with folks is to present some of the homework that we've done and basically have you grade us and correct us and provide your input on what we got right and what we didn't. And one of the most kind of fundamental things that we've done, and one of the lessons learned in conservation planning and also using the open standards, is to really understand what you're trying to protect, and you need to summarize those things that you care about and those things you want to conserve. And we're looking at a large landscape here across that whole ecoregion. And so, one of the lessons learned is that you don't want to list every single species and plant and animal out there, so you want to summarize it. And so what we've done is identify 8 different conservation targets across the area. And a conservation target is something that we care about, that we want to protect, maintain, restore across the landscape. And so, one of the first things that we want to get your feedback is, did we classify this right? Are we using the right focal habitat types, focal species, or coarse filter conservation targets here? So we've identified, of course, sage steppe is the matrix across the landscape, riverine and riparian systems, wetlands, this concept of connectivity. It's not a species or an ecosystem, but it's something that we do want to maintain and protect or restore. Looking at salt desert scrub, particularly in the southern end of the region, cliffs, caves, and talus, juniper woodlands, and aspen woodlands are, based upon our quick look at the literature and outreach to experts, is that these 8 different conservation targets are pretty good representatives. If we want to look across the whole ecoregion, that these are a pretty good classification of those coarse filter things that we want to protect. So what do we want to get from you? We want your knowledge and information and your best professional judgment and all your experience that you've spent in this ecoregion, and the literature you've read, data that you've collected, or data that other people have collected, to help us synthesize this information in a way that makes intuitive sense for managers and for the general public. So we wanted to understand, what is your knowledge of the current condition of a particular target? How is sage steppe doing? How is aspen woodlands doing? And what are the things that we would use to gauge how things are doing? What are some of the future threats on the horizon? Climate change, is it energy development? What are some of those things that might influence conservation targets? And what is your knowledge of that? Do you know of some information, some products, some publications that we can use, some other plans? What are effective strategies? That was one of the things that Nick highlighted. We want to get from you. What are some things that we could do that are effective to maintain, restore, promote conservation of those things we care about? What is the state of information, of data, of the science? What is the state of our knowledge about these conservation targets? And also, hopefully we'll engage with you in a conversation about these conservation targets, not within a particular patch, within a particular management unit, but across the whole landscape. And if you were going to assess the condition of some of these targets, how would you do that? Help us figure that out. We have some ideas that we're going to throw by you based upon the homework that we've done, and what we're looking for is your critical feedback on that. So let's walk through what that might look like. Let's hone into one conservation target, aspen woodlands. And so as we, as Nick kind of talked about conceptualizing these targets, let's talk about these things called key ecological attributes. So this is using the Marathi software. It's a software tool that is used to support the open standards. Here you can see a little key by it, meaning that that's a key ecological attribute of aspen woodlands. Or that is something that if you wanted to understand how aspen woodlands are doing, this is something that you would try to measure at some level. Or this is something that you would use to take the heartbeat, the pulse of a particular conservation target. So what we've done, based upon our review of literature and initial outreach and talking with people, we've identified these 6 or so different key ecological attributes, or KEAs, sometimes we'll talk about. So bird species diversity. So what do we, if we can measure how birds are doing, will that tell us something about how aspen woodlands are doing? Of course, a very important aspect is, how much of the historic aspen woodland is left. That tells us something very important about, how aspen woodlands are doing in the ecoregion. What's the condition of the buffer zone around aspen stands? Is there a Walmart next to aspen stands around here? That would make things in poor condition. Are there a lot of roads? Things like that. Fire regime, of course, is a very important aspect. What is the departure from historic fire conditions? Looking at stand condition, and then we also have something called vertical stand condition. So what we'd like to get from you is, are these the right things that we would use to measure and take the pulse of the conservation target across the ecoregion? Are there other things? Are we missing something? Can we lump things together? For example, could these bottom 2 be lumped? We want to make it kind of the smallest number of things to really get at the condition of aspen woodlands. And then what we want to do is assess the status. Is it fair, good, very good, poor, and get at some measure of that. And so let's look at the percent of historic aspen. So how would we actually go about and assess that it's in good or poor condition? And so what we've done in the open standards, you can identify the poor, fair, good, very good. Again, these are 4 bins that are relevant for managers. Of course, you can break it down to the nth decimal degree to get at some of this. But what we really want to do is provide some basic information on that's relevant for management, and that's how people think of, is it poor, fair, good, very good? Do we need to do anything? Do we need to restore? Do we need to protect? And that will, honing in on this and getting this right will help inform those strategies. So what we've done is we've looked at the literature out there that could potentially support this. For example, we have this publication from Rex Crawford looking at Rocky Mountain aspen forest woodland. It's something called an ecological integrity assessment, where they've actually identified what makes aspen across the landscape good, poor, good, and very good. For example, if it is substantially reduced from its original historic extent, 50 to 80% remains, that would be fair, to very good, where greater than 95% remains. And here we have the reference to back that up. So what we would be looking from you is, does this make sense? Do you have any other information that might support or not support that? And then we've done basically to measure how things are doing right now. There's multiple ways of doing it. We found a publication by Bartos from 2008 that says that current estimates are that approximately 10% of aspen stands are at risk of elimination. So this is what we used as evidence to support that good claim. Are there better? Are there more relevant? This is across the whole Great Basin. Are there more localized data sets? Are there ways that we could look at the landscape and assess that? So that's what we're going to be asking you, and hopefully you'll have some good information to support or something to augment what we've come up with here. Another aspect of the open standards is looking at threat landscape, and so what we've done in our in our preliminary research of plans and assessments is come up with a ranking. Again, what we think of this as a straw dog, and we're giving this out for you to dig into and to provide feedback on. This is by no means the final answer, and that's why we're reaching out and trying to, if you will, co-produce the science and information that goes into this assessment. So altered fire regimes came out as high, and how did we do that? We looked at 3 elements of a threat. One is the scope, is how pervasive is this threat across the whole landscape, the whole study area. We said it was high. How severe is it? We said high. And how irreversible is that? Well, fires, things can grow back from fires, and so we're saying it's medium. And so we have some information and resources that we've used to support that. So what we'd be asking from you is, does this make sense? Do you have any other information or resources to support or not support that? Another aspect, and let's look into this key ecological attribute, is the landscape condition in the buffer zone around a aspen stand. So if you're going to look within 200 hectares around an aspen stand, that is a key indicator of the health of an aspen stand. And so again, we have this information from the same publication, and we're able to actually, they've actually very nicely broken this out using a landscape condition model that already exists out there. We're basically able to overlay aspen stands on top of that landscape condition model and come up with a spatial map of the condition of aspen stands across the whole landscape based upon that information. So, another thing we want to vet with you, does this make sense? Are there other ways that we can assess the condition of aspen and all these other targets? This isn't just about aspen, it's about all the conservation targets across the area. The final thing that we want to get from you is some thinking about strategies. What works in that kind of theory of change and conceptual diagram of how different strategies might work across the landscape. So you may be wondering how this information that we're getting from you will be used. One, the final goal is that if we understand what the limiting factors are, what the condition of things are, what the threats are, and what some effective strategies are, we can develop shared conservation landscape scale strategies. That's the end goal. Eventually, this will hopefully lead into a spatial prioritization of places that have good attributes across the landscape or in good condition. Again, yet to be determined how that will look. Information that will develop into this will be made public and accessible to everybody through a web-based, easy-to-use conservation planning atlas type tool. And then we'll also have a shared understanding of the metrics of current condition and threats. Finally, please put on your calendar, we're thinking of February 15th and 16th, 2017 as dates for a science symposium where some of this information will be discussed further and presented and made available to folks. So thanks for your time. We look forward to talking with you and trying to, it's always one of the great joys of conservation planning is getting out there and talking with experts and hearing folks' experience and understanding of the systems out there. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Tom. Yeah, so to follow up with that, we'll be hitting the road over the next couple of months to vet the open standards through experts, and we've sent out an original letter to a long list of experts that we identified with a small group of folks, and we'd be happy to connect with more people if you think someone should be added to that list. So definitely please let us know. There'll be a survey at the end of today's webinar with an additional comments area, so you could just add it into that comments area or send me, Levi, the project coordinator, an email. So now we're going to open it up to questions and comments. We're happy to hear your feedback and answer any questions that you have. And I'll just wait to hear from you, Sarah, as questions come up into the control panel.
Great, thanks, Levi. We don't have any questions at the moment, but if you do have a question, please feel free to enter it into the control panel that's on the right side of your page. Okay, we just got a question. Question is, how are cultural values being incorporated?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try to answer that, and that's one thing that we haven't got into yet because it's not really it's something that we're still trying to formulate within kind of the steering committee and a smaller group of folks right now. Is well, the great thing about the open standards is that there is this ability, and I'll let Nick talk about this too if he wants, of articulating a human well-being targets. And eventually that is something that we want to get to, is having a balance of conservation, habitat, species targets, along with human well-being targets. Right now, we're not at that stage where we've articulated and done that kind of research that we can vet that. But I think that is something that we will do eventually, is do a process that is similar to this for human well-being targets. And Levi or Nick, I'll let you jump in on that.
Yeah, this is Levi. I can jump in real quick and just say that we've started some initial conversations with some experts in the field of human dimensions. I've also been having individual meetings with folks that have an interest in rural livelihoods in this region, as well as some of the tribal interests in this region as well. So a lot of those conversations are very active at the moment, and I think also in our first steering committee at the end of May, it was highlighted that that's a very important thing that we need to consider on this landscape, and we're all excited to explore that throughout this process as an addition to kind of the flora, fauna, and habitat synthesis work that we've been going through. Nick, did you want to add anything on human well-being targets within the open standards?
No, I think you guys covered it. I mean, I think it's one of the challenges that we've recognized, and it was one of the improvements added to the open standards, as I showed you briefly in some of those examples, but that ability to represent some of the human values of the system, and then understanding the relationship to the ecological values as well. And of course, when you're with resource users, we've had to adapt the open standards in certain ways. Like, for example, we talk about threats. One of the threats could be, for example, ranching or grazing. And then you find out your partners are some of the livestock or ranchers. They get pretty irritated when they're labeled as threats. And so we've had to solve that by either thinking about the threats, not calling them threats, but calling them pressures, or saying that the threat is inappropriate livestock grazing. It's not all livestock grazing. It's the wrong kind of livestock grazing. So there are a number of accommodations that have to be made in order to work with stakeholders and make sure we incorporate human values.
Great.
Thanks, Nick.
We have a couple more questions here. First one is, what other LCCs are using the OSP now to develop landscape design? Is there any cross-LCC coordination ongoing about adopting this process?
Yeah, I'll try to address that. There is active conversations right now about the open standards, and I think they're nascent right now, and they're just kind of emerging. I'm trying to think of, I can think of the Columbia Plateau, which is in Washington State, centered in Washington State, a little bit into Oregon and Idaho. That was driven through an open standards process of identifying targets and shared strategies and using the same set of tools. Also in the Northwest Coast, that project has not started yet, but we'll be using the open standards in that project as well. So I think there is kind of this trend towards the, if landscape conservation cooperatives are about working collaboratively across different agencies and organizations, having a tool that kind of transcends and bridges those, like the open standards, makes a lot of sense, and I think people in the LCC community are acknowledging that. I know there's folks in Alaskan, the Boreal LCC, which is using open standards, and I'm sure there's a few others.
This is Nick. I see Jed Wright is on the call as well. I don't think he can speak, but Jed is working in Maine and in Region 5, and they've been piloting a lot of this stuff as well. And I think you're absolutely right. I'm sort of an outsider here, at least from the Fish and Wildlife Service or from Interior's perspective, but I think there are a number of pilot cases of trying and using this tool and its associated routines with various places. It would be interesting at some point to bring those different folks together and have a conversation about if and how it would make sense to do that more systematically across Fish and Wildlife and other agencies.
Great, thanks. Well, any more, Sarah?
Yeah, we have a few more. Okay, so the next one is, will there be an opportunity to vet and discuss the ratings with the group? My experience with this methodology suggests that these conversations can be very productive and informative. This person apologizes they joined late, so if this has been already answered, they apologize.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and you know, given a lot of constraints, I suppose, on geography and people's timing, what we're doing first is having interviews with experts that we're, you know, Levi has sent out a letter to a wide range of people, trying to solicit information first through interviews, and then that, you know, that's going to be really a focus of the Science Symposium in February, is then having a group discussion about what we've learned. You know, we do want to make this engaged as possible. So, you know, maybe there will be WebExes at some point around particular conservation targets. For example, if we reach out to 3 or 4 people about sage steppe and we're hearing, you know, it would be great to present that information that we've learned from those different interviews to the people that we talk to, and the broader group as well. So I think there will be multiple avenues for people to have group conversations and interviews. You know, the interviews are great because you can really kind of get a lot of information from and expertise from people in a short amount of time. So we're hoping to use both approaches, probably interviews, some webinars, and then the symposium to get at that. Levi, I'll let talk about that too.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would say that we're really excited about, you know, kind of going through an interview process with small groups of people for individual targets, and then kind of following that up with a bigger group conversations. But we also want to definitely be conscious of people's time, knowing that everyone's busy and those sorts of things. So if you do have a, you know, if you are, you know, someone who wants to give feedback on one specific target and you have and you know some other folks, it would be great to get to the table. We're definitely willing to entertain that at any point in time. We're excited to talk to people as much as possible.
And if this is Nick, if I could just throw in here, I think the questioner is absolutely right that in these open standards process, there's obviously value in the products that are produced and in the documentation of the thinking of the group, but the real value here is in the conversation and in the discussion. And the key here is to really allow, either through the kinds of structured interviews and input that these guys are talking about, or through group settings, making sure you allow people to sort of have that discussion and then use the tools to record the results so that you can then move forward from there.
And just one more thing, Tom mentioned the Science Symposium, and we were just, I was just telling Nick earlier before the webinar today that we're hoping that the second day of the Science Symposium is some sort of workshopping with experts, and we aren't quite sure where we'll be in the open standards process at that point, but we definitely hope that that's a time for that sort of conversation. Sarah?
Great. So we had a comment come in about LCC coordination, mentioning Great Lakes LCC and Coastal Wetlands LCD. Just wanted to note that before we went on to the next question. Okay, so the next question is, I'm curious as to what the conservation planning atlas will look like and who the primary audience will be.
Right. No, that's another great question. And I think what the Conservation Planning Atlas looks like is, hopefully it's up to not just us, but kind of the people that engage with the project and provide input. I think there's different conservation planning atlas type tools that are out there and that you could probably look at. The South Atlantic LCC has developed a conservation planning atlas or a blueprint, a viewer on their website. Basically, in my mind, and again, this is just my mind, it would be a spatial look at the ecoregion and be able to click on a particular geography, then it would come up with information about the conservation targets found in that geography. And I think a lot of that information will be pulled through this open standards process and any other spatial kind of information or assessments that we pull together. I think it is yet to be determined whether it's going to be a map of priority places or whether we even want to go down that route or not. So there is a steering committee that is driving this project, and I could let Levi talk about the steering committee. And there will also be technical teams that develop, and I could imagine that there will be a technical team that develops around the creation of this conservation planning atlas. It will probably be a pretty small team of folks, and probably ad hoc type team that might figure out what the dimensions, what it looks like, and what it does. And I think understanding the audience, to us, I think the audience should be as broad as possible, and we should make a tool that is accessible to multiple sectors and stakeholders, from general public to resource managers. Levi, any?
Yeah, I would just add on a couple things that Tom said, which is that we've done a fairly thorough job with the beginning kind of first round of open standards, and we're really excited to start vetting this in the landscape. But there's other parts of our project that are pretty young, and we've done a lot of our really big outreach push just in the last 4 months, and had our first steering committee meeting at the end of May, and we'll have another steering committee meeting here coming up in September. And so we're still kind of finding our way with the project, and the final outcomes aren't determined yet, but we're just kind of refining key issues and presenting different routes to the steering committee at the current moment, and then we'll figure kind of it out for how we take the open standards process from there, whether it's a conservation planning atlas or another sort of decision support tool. Another thing that has really been highlighted on the landscape, there's a lot of decision support tools, and they're coming up kind of right and left, and some are used more than others, and that we definitely see that outreaching to kind of teach people how to use the tools, and also taking feedback and implementing them, and having it kind of being an iterative process of adding to the conservation atlas and tweaking things and things like that is a very important part to the success and longevity of these sorts of projects.
Great. We have one more question that came in. Will there be a summary provided from this webinar, next steps, etc.? I will note that this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the Great Basin LCC YouTube page. So if you wanted to go back and watch it, you can go there later this week. But Levi, Tom, or Nick, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, this is Levi. I would just say my contact information is up on the screen right now, and we'll probably post the webinar, like Sarah said, directly to this webpage, the Northwest Basin and Range portion of the Great Basin LCC webpage. And if you're interested in any more information, feel free to reach out to me at that email. We could set up a phone call or whatever is needed. Yeah, that's all I have.
And then there was one more request to please put up the slides so that they can be viewed later. Those slides will be also in the recording.
Yeah. Thanks. Is that it for questions, Sarah?
Yeah, that's all the questions we have so far.
Okay, great. Well, I'll just do a quick wrap up and say thank you very much for attending today's webinar. Please share this information with people that missed it. There'll be a recording. And if you have more questions, connect with me. Well, there's going to be a short survey at the end of the webinar. It's both just kind of some feedback on the webinar. We always like to improve our presentation skills, so please provide us some feedback, and also there will be a space for additional comments if you want to make any comments. So thanks so much for attending the webinar today.